It was Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Finals, and the entire weight of basketball history was balanced on a single evening in Salt Lake City. The Chicago Bulls were facing the Utah Jazz with the series tied at 3 games apiece, and everything that Michael Jordan had built over 13 years of professional basketball had arrived at this precise moment. 6 championships in 8 years was the possibility on the table, a dynasty completed, a legacy sealed beyond argument. And standing between Jordan and that legacy was a Utah Jazz team that had pushed the Bulls to the absolute edge of their capacity in ways that very few teams had ever managed. The context surrounding that game, however, was not only about the Jazz. It was about a conversation that had been building throughout that entire playoff run, a conversation that had started quietly in the margins of sports media and had grown louder with each passing round until it had become impossible to ignore. Kobe Bryant, 20 years old, in only his second NBA season, had been making statements in interviews and in the implicit language of his performances that suggested a fundamental reassessment was underway. He had not attacked Jordan directly. He was too intelligent and too aware of optics for that. But the message in what he said and how he said it was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. In a television interview conducted 3 days before Game 6, a reporter asked Kobe who he believed was the most dominant player in basketball at that precise moment in time. It was a question designed to create a headline, and Kobe understood that. He smiled in the way that suggested he understood the trap and was choosing to walk into it anyway, because some part of him believed that the answer he was about to give was simply true, and therefore worth saying. He said that Michael Jordan was the greatest player in the history of the game, and that nothing he was about to say should be interpreted as disrespect to that legacy. And then he said that dominance was a present tense concept, that it described what was happening right now on the court and not what had happened before, and that when he looked at basketball in the present tense in the spring of 1998, he saw himself as the most physically dominant player in the sport. He said Jordan was a legend. He said legends and dominance were different categories. He said it with the particular calm of someone who has rehearsed the thought enough times that it no longer feels provocative to them, only accurate. The quote was on every sports television program within hours. The framing was immediate and unanimous. Kobe Bryant, 20 years old, 2 seasons into his professional career, had effectively claimed superiority over Michael Jordan at the exact moment Jordan was attempting to win his 6th championship. The audacity of the timing was either breathtaking or revealing depending on your interpretation. And the sports media spent the 72 hours before Game 6 exploring both interpretations with considerable enthusiasm. Jordan heard the quote the same day it aired. The person who told him about it was a member of the Bulls' traveling staff who made the mistake of mentioning it casually, assuming Jordan had already seen it. Jordan had not. He was described by several people present as receiving the information without visible reaction, which was the reaction that people who knew him well had learned to read most carefully. He asked the staff member to repeat the exact words Kobe had used. The staff member repeated them. Jordan nodded once, said nothing further, and went back to what he had been doing, which was reviewing film of Utah's defensive rotations. Phil Jackson noticed a change in Jordan's preparation over the following 2 days that he later described as a qualitative shift rather than a quantitative one. Jordan was not preparing harder because harder was not possible at that point in his career. He was preparing differently. There was a specificity to his focus that went beyond the Jazz, beyond the championship, beyond the series. Jackson had coached Jordan long enough to recognize the particular quality of attention that appeared when Jordan was playing for reasons that extended beyond the game in front of him, when he was playing to answer something. When the court was about to become the place where a question that had been asked in words was going to be answered in a different language entirely. The night of Game 6, the Delta Center in Salt Lake City was an atmosphere that veteran observers of basketball described as among the most intense they had experienced in a regular season or playoff context. The Jazz crowd was extraordinary in the way that Utah crowds were extraordinary in that era, loud, unified, genuinely frightening in the conviction of their belief that their team was going to win. The Jazz had home court advantage and had used it effectively throughout the series. The building felt from the opening moments of warm-ups like a place that had decided in advance what was going to happen. Jordan came onto the floor for warm-ups and went through his routine with the mechanical consistency that was its own form of psychological message. He did not look at the crowd. He did not engage with the noise. He moved through his shooting routine, his stretching, his ball handling work, with the focused serenity of someone who has separated themselves so completely from external environment that the environment simply does not reach them. Several Jazz players watched him during warm-ups. Their body language suggested that what they were seeing was not reassuring. The game began, and Jordan was immediately, from the very first possession, operating at a level that the building recognized before it had time to process what it was seeing. His first basket came 40 seconds into the game, a pull-up jumper from the right elbow over Brian Russell's outstretched hand. It was a shot Jordan had made 10,000 times in practice and hundreds of times in games, and he made it with the same unhurried precision that characterized every version of it, as if the 40,000 decibel crowd and the championship stakes and the context of everything surrounding the moment were simply not variables in the equation. But there was something different about him that night that went beyond the basketball. It was a quality of presence that transcended the individual plays and expressed itself in the overall texture of how he occupied the game. Teammates described it afterward as playing alongside someone who had removed the possibility of a certain outcome from consideration. Not through arrogance, not through bravado, but through a kind of settled certainty that communicated itself in every movement and every decision. Scottie Pippen said years later that he had played alongside Jordan in hundreds of games, and that Game 6 of the 1998 Finals was the only game where he felt from the opening tip that the result had already been determined by something that existed outside of basketball. That they were playing through a conclusion that Jordan had already reached in some interior space that the game itself was only catching up to. The Jazz came out with a defensive scheme that was specifically designed around limiting Jordan's mid-range opportunities, forcing him left, crowding his release point, using double teams earlier in possessions than was strategically conventional. It was intelligent defensive basketball, and it represented the best collective thinking of a coaching staff that had spent years studying how to slow him down. For the first 6 minutes of the game, it created some disruption. Jordan made 2 passes out of double teams that led to open threes that his teammates missed. He adjusted his approach without visible frustration, which was itself a form of excellence, the capacity to recognize that a particular path is being closed and to redirect without losing momentum or rhythm. By the end of the first quarter, Jordan had 11 points and 4 assists. The assists were as important as the points because they communicated something to the Jazz defense, which was that doubling Jordan was going to create problems for them regardless of whether it slowed his scoring. The message was received. The Jazz began to back off slightly in the second quarter, giving him more space in an attempt to limit the damage he was doing as a passer. He immediately converted that space into scoring. 6 points in the first 4 minutes of the second quarter, each basket more efficient than the last, each one arriving through a different mechanism as if he was working through a systematic inventory of everything the defense could not take away from him simultaneously. He went into halftime with 20 points. The Bulls led by 3. The building was loud, but the quality of the crowd noise had shifted from the certainty of the opening tip to something that contained a thread of unease. The kind of unease that comes from watching someone operate in a way that does not respond to the things that normally disrupt performance. The Jazz crowd was trying to affect Jordan with noise, with will, with the collective force of their belief in their team, and Jordan was moving through the first half as if those forces were present, but operating on a frequency he had learned to filter out so completely that their existence was essentially theoretical to him. The third quarter was where the game changed in a way that stopped being about basketball tactics and started being about something more fundamental. Jordan scored 16 points in the third quarter, 16 points in 12 minutes against a defense that was specifically designed to prevent exactly that. He made shots from positions that the defense had constructed to be impossible, a turnaround jumper from the left block with 2 defenders in his space, a step-back 3 from the right wing that nobody in that building, including Jordan's own teammates, expected him to attempt. A driving layup through contact that demonstrated the specific combination of body control and competitive will that made him impossible to game plan against, because the variables of his game extended beyond what conventional defensive preparation could account for. With 4 minutes remaining in the third quarter, Jordan caught the ball at the top of the key, surveyed what the Jazz defense was giving him, and made a decision that several basketball analysts later identified as the single moment that defined the entire game. He drove baseline, drew 2 defenders, elevated from a position that was not a conventional takeoff point for any player in the league, and finished with his left hand over Stockton and a recovering Russell. The distance covered between his takeoff and the basket, the arc of his body through the air, the adjustment made in mid-flight to account for Stockton's presence, produced a moment that caused the Jazz crowd to fall silent. Not the silence of disengagement, the silence of witnessing something that required a suspension of the ordinary framework through which you understand what human bodies are capable of on a basketball court. He scored 36 points in what would be the final game of his career as a Chicago Bull. He added 9 assists and 8 rebounds. He made the shot that everyone who watched basketball has seen thousands of times, the pull-up jumper over Brian Russell with 5 seconds remaining, hand in Russell's face, perfect elevation, perfect release, the kind of shot that should not go in under those circumstances by any rational assessment of probability, and it went in with the inevitability of something that had been decided long before the game began. The Bulls won by 3. The championship was complete. 6 titles. The dynasty was finished in the way that dynasties are finished when the architect decides they are finished, not when the competition decides it for them. Jordan stood at center court after the final buzzer, eyes closed, ball pressed to his chest, and the building that had been trying to will his failure for 3 hours gave him a standing ovation. Not because Jazz fans wanted him to win, because they had watched something that transcended the outcome of their team's season and required acknowledgement that existed outside of partisanship. The clip of that Jordan ovation was shown on sports television for days. Analysts discussed it in terms of what it revealed about the nature of sporting excellence, about what happens when greatness operates at a frequency that even opposition cannot deny. But what almost nobody discussed in those days immediately following the game was what had preceded it. What had been said 3 days earlier in a television interview by a 20-year-old in Los Angeles who had looked into a camera and suggested, with the particular calm of someone who believes they are telling a truth, that dominance was a present tense concept and that the present tense belonged to him. Kobe Bryant watched Game 6 from Los Angeles. He had finished his second season with the Lakers 3 weeks earlier. He was 20 years old, and he was, by any honest assessment, one of the 5 or 6 most talented basketball players on the planet. He had genuine claim to everything he believed about himself except for one thing, which was the question of present-tense dominance, and Game 6 of the 1998 Finals answered that question in a language that required no interpretation. He did not publicly address what Jordan had done in that game in immediate relation to what he had said in the interview. He was too composed and too strategic for that. But in an interview conducted several months later, when a journalist asked him about the greatest performance he had ever witnessed, he said Game 6 of the 1998 Finals without hesitation. He said that watching Jordan in that game had clarified something for him that he had not fully understood before, which was the difference between being exceptional and being complete. He said that exceptional described a level of skill that many players reached. He said complete described something different, something that could only be assembled over years of competing in situations where everything was on the line and absorbing from each of those situations exactly what it had to teach. He said he had been exceptional for 2 years. He said that night in Salt Lake City had shown him what complete looked like, and he said that becoming complete was going to take longer than he had previously calculated. It was the most honest thing he had said publicly about Jordan, and it was more valuable than the interview 3 days before Game 6, because it was not performing confidence. It was doing something rarer and more difficult, which was learning in public. Acknowledging that a question he thought he had been answered differently by something that could not be argued with. Jordan retired at the end of that season for the second time. He came back again, as the world knows, for 2 seasons with Washington, carrying a different kind of mission through a different kind of body. But what he did in Salt Lake City on that June evening was the last act of the dynasty, the final sentence of the argument that had been building since 1984. And the argument, stated plainly, was that dominance in basketball was not simply about physical gifts or competitive drive or tactical intelligence or any single component in isolation. It was about the integration of all of those things at a level so complete that the whole became something greater than the sum of its parts, something that could not be interrupted by crowd noise or defensive schemes or the passage of time, or the emergence of gifted young competitors who were right about almost everything except the precise moment at which their time had come. The court is the only place where that argument can be made. Jordan made it 36 times that night, once for each point, and the arena fell silent in the way that arenas fall silent when the thing they have been resisting has arrived anyway, inevitable and complete and beyond dispute.